Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'll do the land acknowledgement and then we'll get into it. The Toronto Field Naturalists acknowledge this land through which we walk. For thousands of years, the land has been shared by the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. Toronto is situated on the land within the Toronto Purchase, known as Treaty 13. It is the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is also part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a covenant agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples and allied nations to peaceably share the land and all its resources. Today, the land is home to peoples of numerous nations. We are all grateful to have the opportunity to continue to care for and share the beauty of this land. And with that, a warm welcome to everyone on the Zoom call this evening. This event has been shared on several social media channels aside from the TFN website. If you heard about it through one of those other channels, please put it in the chat. Gives us an idea of how well the message is getting out there. So appreciate that. And for those of you that are not TFN members, we hope you will come again to other calls and maybe join us at the Toronto Field Naturalists. I'd like to say thank you to the whole lecture team for organizing the lecture series and including especially today's lecture on ants and their amazing biodiversity. TFN is entirely volunteer run, and we're always happy to have new faces on our teams, as Ellen has mentioned. I'd like to introduce Dr. Erin Fairweather shortly. First, a bit about this evening's theme. So get ready to hear about wars, espionage, animal husbandry, and even air conditioning. These are all themes connected to the remarkable diversity of ants, their ecologies, and the behaviors found around the GTA. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Erin Fairweather. Dr. Fairweather is an entomologist from Guelph, Ontario. They've had a lifelong passion for insects, keen to learn all they could. At age 15, they helped curate the entomological collection at the New Brunswick Museum and became a research associate there. Ants were understudied in the Maritime provinces, which drew Erin towards this group of insects. Ever since, ants have fascinated Erin, and they dedicated their undergraduate and graduate career to studying them. Erin's master's focused on ant diversity and ecology in Ontario and New Brunswick, and their PhD focused on how environmental contaminants impact ant communities on farms. They are currently a sessional lecturer and researcher in toxicology, biochemistry, and entomology at the University of Guelph. And now, Dr. Fairweather, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Let's do this. All right. Get this started. Okay, everybody can see it. Hey, okay.
Looks good.
Yep, it's good.
Perfect. Awesome. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about ant diversity, ecology, and behavior in general. I'm going to try and focus it a little bit in around Ontario, but I really like getting into the nitty-gritty of the ecologies and behaviors because I think that's what draws people to this group, and you'll see why as we go through. So the bio was very good. A little bit about me was my master's really focused on ant taxonomy and ecology, and my PhD really focused on ant biochemistry and our impacts on ants around Ontario. So I've kind of gone through the gambit of ant research, and I think that'll come out throughout my presentation, just how wide a breadth this really does cover. One of the things I want to say as we get into this lecture is this is going to be between 20 to 40 minutes. I tried to tether things down. Usually this lecture is around 3 hours, so it took a little bit of time. So there's a lot more to talk about with this, but I think I got some interesting things in here. Okay, so what we're really going to focus on is first, global diversity, morphology, and life cycle. So getting you a good overview of what ants are like, how they interact with the environment and where they're found, and then really looking at the species of Ontario. So what are you going to see when you go out into your own backyards and in the local parks, that kind of thing. And then I think getting an idea for the diversity is great, but now having a lens by which you can see the interesting behaviors, I think that's the big important part. So we're going to focus a lot on behaviors such as communication, nesting, parasitism, and collaborations. Really fascinating things that you're going to be able to see in your own backyards. And that's where I get the title, There's a War in Your Own Backyard. And then sharing a little bit of the human perspective. So where do we come in relation to how we engage with ants? So what we're talking about is ants or Hymenoptera formicidae, one family of insects. They are eusocial. So that means that we have a queen that is in charge of an entire colony of individual workers. They're made up of a variety of keystone or important organisms in our ecosystems. They provide really important services, and we're going to see some of those as we go through. They're largely generalists or omnivores, so they're interacting with a lot of different organisms in the environment. They occupy a diverse range of habitats, have a whole bunch of different morphologies and behaviors, and we're going to see all of these. So around the world, there's about 20,000 species, quite a bit, and that's only increasing. We're constantly learning new things about this group, and the estimate is around 40,000 species we probably actually have globally. There's been estimates of about 20 quadrillion individuals on the planet. Some estimate that they outweigh human biomass 4 to 1. There's a range in there, but there's quite a few ants on the planet. They occupy every terrestrial ecosystem except for Antarctica. There's around 1,000 species in North America, and about 135 are found in Ontario specifically. Now, if any of you are familiar with ant or insect morphology in general, you're kind of gonna have to throw out everything that you know. Typically, with an insect, we have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. But with an ant, we've kind of renamed a lot of the parts. So we have a head, altitrunk, petiole, and gaster. It's the same kind of sections, but they're split up a little bit differently. The big thing to take away from this is that there's a huge range and a wide difference between a lot of ants and other insects and within the ants. In fact, we have some individuals within species that have wings, some without wings, some look pretty archaic. And so the males have actually historically been treated as an entirely different family. It's only been within the past 100 years that we've realized that some of the things that looked quite different from each other were actually the same because of genetics. So there's quite a few species to species variation. And then within species, we have what's called castes. And those castes make this story all the more complicated. The castes can be split up between just the males and the females, like I hinted at. The females are kind of the typical morphology that we're used to seeing with these. They're typically quite a bit larger. The males look archaic and almost wasp-like in morphotype. Depending on the species that you're dealing with, though, we also have different roles split up in amongst the colony of ants. And these roles have very different expressions of their genetics, and which results in different morphologies. These are things that are related to things like nest protection, foraging, brood care. Some even garden or tend animals, and they are different in their general shape. So you can see on the screen there, we have some things called medians or minims, the queens versus soldiers. These are all different morphotypes, but they're the same species of individual, and in fact, in the same colony. We're going to see some examples of that as we get into species-specific levels. Generally, in terms of the life cycle of an ant, we have the queen. The queen has mated with a male. It goes out and flies, finds a nice place to live, nests there, creates its nest, lays eggs. These eggs turn into larvae. The larvae then pupate and then eventually become the adults, which is typically the workers. Over the first year to two of their life, the colony will grow in size, more and more workers accumulated into that colony. And then about once per year after they become reproductively viable, they will have a nuptial flight. So the queen will start laying new males and virgin queens, the princesses, so to speak. And then they will all fly at the same time, find other colonies of ants, and then mate with their queens to be. And so that's how they spread their genetics. Now, a single queen can live for a year to up to 80 years. There are some species that will live quite a while. And even workers can range from 1 to 5 years in length. And so there's one reproductive cycle per year for these species typically. And then you can combine these two things. So you have castes that are morphologically different, and sometimes there's castes that are life dependent. So with a worker that lives for over a year, you might have it start as something called a nurse. So it's in the colony, tending to other brood, tending to new larvae. And then as soon as they become old enough, they go out and they forage, they look for food. And then as they get older, they are a little bit weaker. And so they come back into the colony and become nurses. So this difference in behavior and morphotype contribute to a wide range of different behaviors and functions in the nest and outside of the nest. And we're going to see, again, a bunch of examples of this throughout the lecture. And so this results in a huge amount of diversity within colonies and between different species. We have things called door ants that have morphologies that turn them into doors. There's trap jaw ants, which can use really high-powered jaw muscles to blast themselves into the stratosphere, so to speak. And then we have things like sub-Saharan silver ants that are really dedicated to dealing with the heat of a desert. We're not going to see as much of this diversity throughout today's lecture, but it does exist in a global context. For today, really focusing in on Ontario, there's about 17 extant families across the globe, and about 5 of them occur around Ontario specifically. And we're going to look at each of these groups and how you might pick them out from the local environments. So first we have the Ponerinae and the Amblyponae. These are fairly small subfamilies, largely subterranean. You rarely end up seeing them, but a common genus is the Ponera. They typically have colonies around 20 to 50 workers, and they look more wasp-like. So they might be a little bit hard to pick out from other things. And they're usually used as a genetic outgroup for a lot of research because of this. We have the Dolichodorinae. So they are often associated with bogs. You'll see them most commonly in things like sphagnum. Again, not super widely encountered, but you might see them as you're hiking through some of the parks around Ontario. The Myrmicinae are one of the more common groups. You'll see some species in your lawns, but one of the most commonly encountered species, if you like foraging or looking around in the undergrowth, is the acorn ants. So if you're picking apart small twigs or opening up acorns at all, you're going to get a surprise by finding little colonies of Taponoma, Chromatogaster, or Leptothorax in amongst them. By far the most widely encountered subfamily is the Formicinae. They're the largest subfamily in around Ontario. They're also really tolerant of a lot of environments. So you'll often see them in places like lawns, in amongst fields, in agricultural fields with a lot of the work that I do. And they're the charismatic kind of black or red and black ants that you'll see around. One of my favorite groups within the Formicinae is the Lasius group. They're also known as citronella ants. They're bright yellow, but if you are avid gardeners at all, you'll often see them when you're digging in your garden beds. They're subterranean colonies, and then as you unearth them, you'll get this big whiff of citrus or citronella because they use that citronella as a defensive mechanism. So bright yellow ants that you'll often see in your backyard, very vibrant and smell very nice. Now, getting into ant behavior in general, we have a variety of different categories which we're going to go through. Like I said on the onset, things like communication, nesting, how they interact with other species. So inter and intra-species, or within a single colony or between other colonies of ants, or with other organisms, as it turns out in the environment, there's a large amount of communication. We get multiple different kinds of nesting strategies. And because of this organization between individuals in the environment and their communications with other species, they are highly, highly successful. And we'll see a lot of examples of that as we go through. One of the most common ways that ants communicate, and one of the things that a lot of people have become familiarized with through works like E.O. Wilson, is through pheromones. So it's the use of chemical compounds in order to communicate to one another various signals in the environment. This can be things like if there's a foraging route nearby, if there is a threat near them, or the identity of the nest that they're dealing with, whether there is the same species, another species, or in fact the same nest of ants. And so they have various glands on their exoskeleton. They release chemicals depending on the environment or situation that they're put in. Now, these can range quite a bit. The chemical structure or the concentration of the chemical that they release can be different from different colonies that we're dealing with or different species. And so these chemicals have sometimes been co-opted by other species to mimic themselves. And we're going to see some of that happening later on. But one of the things to keep in mind is this is a chemical cue, right? So if you're laying down a chemical trail, that might not be very useful if there is a unusual climatic event or you're in a different place in the world. Say you're in the tropics where it rains all the time. That chemical is going to get washed away all the time. Or you're in the desert, the sands are going to be shifting. So it's not always that useful. So communication through pheromones isn't the only thing that ants use. One of the other means of communication is acoustic or through stridulation. So some ants will either use their mandibles to make this happen, make little sounds through their mandibles. Others will actually use it through the tergites on their exoskeleton. So the little plates on, say, the gaster, they will rub it together like a cricket or a grasshopper, and it'll make a screeching sound. And this screeching sound can vary from one colony to another or from one species to another. There's a really great example of this in practice from this Ferrari et al. In 2010 paper. So there was one species thought to exist all across South America in this Megaponera group. Scientists then realized that if they put a little microphone up to the nest and listened in on it, different nests had different sounds. And some of these sounds were quite extremely different from one another. And it turned out that when they were also combining that with genetics, they were in fact different species entirely. So we've used the sounds or the voices or the accents that ants make to differentiate different species. I'll give you an example of how significant that is. If this doesn't play or the sound doesn't come through, let me know. So we have one example here. Oops. Back. There we go.
I'm not hearing it, Aaron.
Not hearing it? Okay. Okay. Well, suffice to say, I can provide the links later on, but they do sound quite a bit different. I believe you can also find this on YouTube. They have little violins that are different from one another. It's pretty amazing.
Thanks.
The last kind of big means of communication that ants use is tactile or through antenna. So in close quarters, these ants will tap antenna with their sisters to identify whether there's a resource nearby or the directionality of a food, that kind of thing. This is kind of similar to the idea of the waggle dance that you might have heard from bees. So depending on the kinds of tapping that they do or the direction that they point in, they'll be able to tell the distance to a food item or how close or far it is or various other details. This can often be combined in conjunction with pheromones because they have receptors on those antennae to tell, additional details about what's going on or ask whether or not you're actually the right sister from the same colony. Pretty fascinating. Next, we have a variety of different nesting techniques that these ants used. So you've probably heard quite a bit about the ants that nest underground or in logs. So soil nesting and log nesting, very common amongst a variety of ant species. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, that image, this is a very massive ant nest of leafcutter ants. It occupies around 20 meters by 50 meters, I believe, and it was a large excavation event. So these chambers are massive, occupy and huge ranges of space. And these have a variety of different functions. So different chambers are used for things like brood care versus queen care versus food storage and the like. They also use the environment to their advantage. So you might have a brood chamber that's very close to the surface or often underneath a rock, so it radiates heat better and you get the brood growing a little bit faster. So all kinds of different techniques to make sure their living situation is as comfortable and as efficient as possible. And this ranges quite a bit between species. We also get some species that nest in canopies. One of my favorite examples of this is the weaver ants. So Oecophylla is the genus for these species. They're often encountered in East Asia and Central Africa. But these are canopy dwelling ants that kind of combine the use of behavior and cooperation and morphology to their advantage. They will knit leaves together in the canopy to form their nests. They do this by having large groups of individuals pulling on those trees to get them close to one another. And then they will use the larvae as hot glue guns. So larvae will spin cocoons, very similar to what you see with moths or butterflies. And these species have adapted to learn to use that silk in other ways. They will tack it on one side of the leaf and another, and through constant application, they will get the leaves stitched together, and then they form a wide basket nest in the canopy of a forest. It requires a huge amount of that communication we just talked about, and of course, that specialization in morphology. Okay, now this is one of my favorite topics to cover. Ants, obviously, from what I've talked about so far, they have kind of got it figured out, right? They interact a lot with other species, but really in large part interactions between other species and the environment, they've been successful. Very similar to us, they have massive cities underground. They don't really have to compete with their environment at large as much anymore. One of the biggest competitive factors for them in the environment is each other. You have, say, a lawn, your front lawn, it's got dozens of different colonies of very common species. And so they're all interacting in space and competing for that space and the resources they're in. And over time, evolutionarily, millions and millions of years, this competitive pressure has pushed them into very unique behaviors. This is social parasitism. So it's different species interacting with each other and taking advantage of each other to find a new niche in the environment. This has come about in two main ways. One is the convergence hypothesis. So you have two very common species in the environment. They're trying to compete for the same resource of space or food. And then one becomes more dominant than the other in the environment. And slowly they start to take advantage of the other species over time in unique ways. We're going to see how that plays out. The other hypothesis is the same nest hypothesis. So you have the same species, and either within the same nest itself, you have more competitive castes that start to speciate from each other, or you have same species in the same environment and they start to outcompete each other in the environment and start to speciate from one another. So same kind of general principle as each other, but slightly different mechanisms. This results in four main types of social parasitism, how they compete with one another. The first is temporary social parasites. So temporary social parasites are queens that will invade another ant queen's nest, a host, and start to take advantage of its resources. They'll start to be taken care of by the host species. They'll feed on the host's food resources, and eventually they might go out on their own and leave that nest after they're feeling strong enough. Or in some cases, that queen might decide, I want to take over this nest. And so it'll assassinate the host queen and slowly start to take over the nest with its own young. Now, this happens in a variety of different ways. I talked about all the means of communication. So the parasite species in this case needs to mimic all of those mechanisms. They need to know the same antennal tapping techniques. They need to have the same kind of dialect as each other in sort of speech, you could say, with the sounds they make. They also have to have the same pheromones, so the same chemicals. This is an extreme form of convergent evolution at play here. It's pretty amazing. Now, after temporary social parasites, we have permanent inquilines. So these are often species that don't go the extra mile to assassinate the host queen, but they decide to live amongst them permanently. So you have a queen entering into this host nest. They start to occupy the same space as each other. The workers of the host will start to take care of the parasite queen, and then they'll just stay in that nest the rest of their lives. In these cases, often that parasite queen doesn't even have its own workers anymore. It's entirely reliant on the host species for its own workers. These species often have nuptial flights at the same time as each other. So the parasite and the host will lay queens and males at the same time. They will fly up, meet each other in the atmosphere, and then go off and start their colonies together. The last, but certainly not least technique is doulosis. So this is commonly called slave making. You have two independent species, two independent nests of organisms, and the parasite species will go and raid the host species, killing the queen and taking the brood back to their own nest. They take that brood, raise it up, and then the workers of that host think they're still in the same colony and will take care of that parasite species. The parasite species is usually a bit larger. The morphology is more made to be combative or aggressive. And then the host is usually a little bit more diminutive. On the video on the right-hand side, we have two different species. The more brown species is Harpagoxenus canadensis. It's a Canadian species. And then the slightly more black species, the smaller one, is Leptothorax canadensis. The Harpagoxenus is the parasite. The small Leptothorax is the host. One last example that I want to give of this, because you can even find this in your own backyards in Ontario, is straight from here, Guelph, my front yard here in the city. So what I was circling there, there's this red and black ant, and you can see it entering a tunnel there. Now, they're coming out of this tunnel in the ground with the white larva in their mandibles. We're going to see in a second here that this is, in fact, a different species. So they're coming out here through this video. The red ant has a pupa in its mouth, is just raided a colony, killed that queen, and they're taking the brood back to their own nests. And this one coming out here has a little black worker in its mandibles, taking that prey item back to its own colony, right? Okay. So we'll skip ahead a little bit here. All right, and you see this black ant individual. This is the host species. So they're trying to save as many brood as they can from their own nest after it's been raided by this parasite species. The red and black, this is Formica acerva, very common Ontario species, is taking that brood, going across this pavement, going across the road to another house down the road. Hard to see on the pavement because of the colors, but they're walking across this pavement back to their own nest with that brood. And we'll skip ahead a little bit here. And this is their nest. So this is the parasite species nest. And you'll notice that we have the red and black ants and those black ants all occupying the same space. The ones that are not kind of nonchalantly walking across the surface there are the host species that have been raised by the doulosis species, the parasite now. And so it's all one nest of these two different species. And in this environment, that slave-making ant won't be able to survive without the host. So this is an actual indication of a healthy environment. If you have quite a bit of this social parasitism going on, then you know that there's a large amount of competition. The soils are healthy. You have a large amount of ant presence in those environments. You can check this in your own backyards. Like I say, this was just at the front yard of my own house in Guelph. An added layer to the story is that they use ant propaganda to make this all happen. So when they're entering these nests, they use a chemical kind of compound to spray it into the host species' face, and it disorients the host. They suddenly can't smell their sisters. They don't know what's going on around them, and this can make them very aggressive. They think that they are being attacked, but they don't know where it's coming from. So they can often start to become aggressive to their own sisters or to the queen of their own colony. And the parasite uses this to their advantage as they're raiding that nest. So ant propaganda hard at work there. Ants don't just interact with their own species in really complicated ways. You've probably heard this quite a bit, but ants also perform some husbandry. They care for their own cattle, similar to us. So, ants will tend aphids, a hemipteran species, very common species of pest within Ontario, for a resource called honeydew. It's a sugary substance that they get from drinking the phloem of plants, kind of similar to a cow producing milk, and the ants use that to their advantage. Care for these aphids, raise them up, and get that resource in return. So it's a mutualistic relationship between the aphids and the ants, though not as mutualistic as we thought it was in the past. Some recent research has shown that the ants will actually start to cull the populations of these aphids after a certain point. They want this resource to be continuous. The aphids don't care if the plant dies, but the ants do. They want to make sure that they have this resource nearby as long as possible. So if the aphids become too intense and start to kill off the plant, the ants will actually start to kill off the aphids, culling them. And this is a protein source. So they'll actually use those aphids as meat, so to speak. And so they use the aphids very similar to we use cattle for milk and for also meat. Very, very interesting. Ants have a wide range of interactions with plants as well. They perform a lot of herbivory. So they feed on things like pollen and nectar and fruit. Some species have collected this plant matter for things like fungal gardens. We're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But because they've had such a tight association with plants for so long, and ants are kind of cognizant of the environment that they're in, and they continually get these resources over time, they want to maintain that relationship. So some plants and some ants have formed mutualistic relationships with each other over time. A really intense version of this exists in the Devil's Gardens. So these are areas of land in the tropics that are colonized by an ant called the lemon ant or the citrus ant. They've evolved to develop a chemical herbicide defense. So similar to the ant propaganda we talked about, this ant will shoot out a chemical from its acidopore, and it will spray it on species of plant it doesn't want in its environment, and that will kill the plant, very similar to how we use herbicides ourselves. And so an entire football-sized area of land in tropical South America can be culled down to 3 species. So you imagine in the tropics, there's thousands of species of plants, but the ants can cull that down to 3 single species of plant. And these plants provide them resources like foods, leaves, habitat to nest in. And so there's this mutualism between these 2 species. The plants want to keep in the favor of the ants over evolutionary time, so they produce more and more resources for the ants, and the ants then protect the plants more and more and cultivate them in the environment. This ant-plant mutualism exists all over the planet. This exists in 3 main ways. So we have elysomes, extra floral nectaries, and cavities in plants. So elysomes are fruiting bodies on seeds, kind of similar to fruit, not the exact same thing. They're specifically made for ants themselves. Highly nutritious bodies on these seeds that the ants will take into their nest and then remove from the seed, and the seed will be allowed to grow inside its nest. The plants get a benefit from this because ant nests typically have higher nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels, which increases the plant's growth. They also get protection from other species maybe trying to feed on those seeds. And then eventually the ants themselves get more of these elysomes as the plant grows up and starts to seed again. So mutualistic in that way. A really good example of this relationship is with a Phaenogaster species in Ontario. They actually are responsible for planting a lot of trillium plants. Trillium plants have these elysomes on their seeds. So without these ant species, we wouldn't nearly have as many trilliums as we do. Next, we got to get into the ant garden. So taking that plant matter, bringing it back into their nests, and using it as a resource for fungi. A very common example of this is with leafcutter ants. You'll see these in places like the ROM has that exhibits of these species, very common South American species, but they have tight associations with these fungi for over millions and millions of years. Leafcutter ants aren't the only ones that do this. Camponotus is a very commonly encountered genus around Ontario. They're commonly known as the carpenter ants. Most people think that carpenter ants actually feed on the wood themselves, but these ants can't process the cellulose and lignin like termites can. They don't have the same bacteria in their guts. Instead, the Camponotus ants feed on the fungi that are feeding on the wood. So they're feeding on the fungi that are already causing rot damage. So instead of causing damage themselves, they're an indicator of you having existing rot in your, say, deck or something like that, which is, I think, important distinction to make with these species. We also have a wide occurrence of things like myrmecophiles. So these are other species of organisms that have taken advantage the intense environmental success that ants have had. So they will occupy themselves in their nests for access to food resources, for access to space. Sometimes this is parasitic, sometimes this is mutualistic, like in the case of the aphids that I talked about previously. A great example of that from Ontario is lichanid butterflies. So this is a species that is endangered in this area. And it turns out that one of the reasons why they were becoming endangered is we were actually extirpating the ant species that are important for their life cycles. So these lichanid butterflies will provide extra floral nectaries to the ants on their own bodies. They produce a sugary substance the ants like. So they bring them into their nest, take care of them, make sure no predators get to them. They pupate in the nest, the ants bring them out, and then they complete their life cycle and become butterflies. All right, and so the last kind of section I want to get into is the interactions that humans and ants have between each other. And if it wasn't obvious to this point in the lecture, I kind of have a bias. I think ants are pretty amazing. I think they should be around, but there is some pest pressure that they do provide. Some of it more valid than others, in my opinion. They do have a venom, some ant species, as they are stinging pests. So they can cause anaphylaxis. Now, in Ontario, we actually only have one species that has a stinger that can pierce human skin, and that is Myrmica rubra, an invasive European species of ant. They can be a nuisance in lawns and golf courses. Some people don't like the mounds that they make. I think it provides ambient nutrition and aeration to the soils, but that's just my opinion. They are at risk for ornamental plants, so there are pest species that will occupy things like greenhouses quite a bit. And some people don't like having them in their homes, but the truth is that these ants actually don't do structural damage. They only indicate structural damage that was already there beforehand. So I don't mind them being in my home one bit. There are quite a few invasive species around the globe. These are species that we've propagated around. So things like the South American fire ant, very common stinging pest species in the US, hasn't made its way to Canada yet. There is yellow crazy ants, European fire ants, that's the one that we have in Ontario, Myrmica rubra. Argentine ants, huge problem. They extirpate native species, and there is something called super colonies. So because we've introduced these in select genomic lineages, they actually do not compete with each other in the environment. They collaborate with their sisters in the environment in the places that they're invasive. And so they will, extirpate any other ant species and collaborate with nearby nests to make sure that they maintain control of large swaths of land. There are some super colonies that exist in hundreds of square kilometers areas in the US. I had to cut a little bit about that in this lecture, but it's a pretty amazing topic if you're interested in it sometime. Highly encourage you to look it up. I also think that ants provide quite a bit of ecosystem services, right? I talked about the seed dispersers. There's a lot of keystone species. So species like those Aphaenogaster ants, they plant those understory herbs that can grow forests after disturbance like forest fire or clear cutting up to 2 times faster than with them absent. So keeping them around is really important. They're also ecosystem engineers, soil aerators, and nutrient cyclers. They regulate plant and vertebrate communities, and they're decomposers. I think this is best exemplified in agricultural environments. This is where my specialty kind of comes in. There are stinging pests and hemipteran tenders in these environments, but these pest pressures are often superseded by their benefits. So that soil aeration, the nutrients that they provide, and the fact that they feed on a lot of pest species in these environments. Ants are actually more and more commonly globally being used as a beneficial indicator. So in Australia, the amount or the species richness that you have in a farm can be an indicator of how healthy that soil is. In fact, in China, for over 2,000 years, weaver ants, the ants I talked about earlier that nest in the canopies, have been used as pest control. And there was a really fascinating paper from the 1980s that showed with weaver ants present, there was more pest control than with pesticides being applied. If you just got rid of all the pesticides, the ants controlled more pests than any of those chemicals would, which is pretty fascinating. And these weaver ants are known to tend aphids, but they're keeping them at a level that is healthy for the trees, which I think is a really amazing service. Ants have also been used historically as food all across the globe for thousands and thousands of years. It's very common in South America to see leafcutter ants, especially during their nuptial flights, used as food. There's actually been infrastructural growth for having factories to grow up these leafcutter ant colonies in captivity and start to produce them for food. And I've had them before. They're pretty delicious when prepared right. Also, weaver ants, the larvae that they provide are kind of a citrusy note. They have a very similar tang as the citronella ants do, and they're a great additive to salads. I've had it as well. It's pretty delicious and very, very high protein source. Very delicious. If you want any more information about ants around Eastern North America, specifically around this region, I highly recommend A Field Guide to the Ants of New England. I helped evaluate this book, so it's a little bit of a self plug, but it is a great resource as a field guide to the ants in this area. And then you can always reach out to me anytime. I love answering questions about ants or insects in general. It's been my passion since I was a toddler. And I'll leave you with potentially a organism that likes ants as much as I do. I took this last year when I was in Costa Rica, an arboreal anteater. Thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions that you have now.
That's great. Thanks very much, Aaron. That was a great talk.
No
Um,
problem.
I have a bunch of questions of my own, but I'm going to hold those because we got a whole bunch of questions in the chat here. Um, so maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of walk through them and give you a chance. You've actually answered, I think, a couple of them.
Okay.
So I'll maybe edit those out as we go, but here we go. So the first one is looks like from Christian. Is there a common or ubiquitous mechanism for caste differentiation in most ants? And he does have an example in something like the Apis mellifera. This is through epigenetic modification, and versus the bombus where there's pheromonal coercion. I know
Yeah.
that's a very technical question, so you might need to recap that a little bit before you give the answer.
Yeah. So that was actually something I had to cut from this talk a little bit. Um, but as you've pointed out, Christian, there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms. Some species do focus on epigenetic factors. So depending on what they've been fed or the chemical cues around them, so the pheromone density in the nest, different casts will be elicited. Most of the species around Ontario rely on behavioral caste selection. So there's not as much morphological difference between these different castes. It's more tropical where we see a huge differentiation. And that's really related to temperature, pheromones, interaction. Sometimes, depending on where the larvae are being touched on their bodies, they'll develop differently. But this is a hugely complicated subject. It's something that we're still learning so much about how in depth this goes. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. We've got a question from Jennifer. She wants to know, and you may have touched on this, what the particular species is that makes the little sandhills on our walkway.
Yeah. So there's two different ones. One of them is the Tetramorium immigrans. It's not actually a native species. It's no longer invasive because it's kind of become naturalized in our area. But it's the most common one that you'll find around Ontario. The native species that we have is Lasius neoniger. It'll also make the same kind of sandy mounds around it. A really cool fact about Tetramorium immigrans, if you're walking around this time of year as the ground is thawing, the boundaries between different colonies of Tetramorium immigrans will start to deteriorate and they'll flood onto the surface of the sidewalk and start to wage war against each other. And so you'll see piles that look like sand almost because they're really small, but it's actually piles of ants on top of one another fighting to the death for that resource of space.
I love that. Okay. And I think maybe you touched on this one too about the European ant. The one that sorry, Dick says the one that bites him in the backyard.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple different species that could be doing that. So the Myrmica rubra is common around here. You will find it in your backyards sometime, and it does sting. There are some species like the black and red ones and the black ones that make larger mounds. The Myrmica rubra doesn't make mounds; it's kind of flat on the ground. But the larger mound building ones, they will bite, but they don't sting. So they don't actually cause anaphylaxis or anything like that. The best way to tell whether you've been stung or bitten is a bite will only last maybe 5 minutes and it'll go away. A sting will kind of raise and sometimes become a little pussy, like it'll get a whitehead. That's when you know you've gotten venom inside of it. Anaphylaxis is super uncommon in ants, though. It's even less common than the venom you get from bees. So if you are allergic to bees, might want to look out, but otherwise, you're going to be pretty safe.
Cool. Sorry. What's the next one here? How big is the invasion of the fire ant, Solenopsis? I think you mentioned that as well.
Yeah. So the Solenopsis species is actually not found in Ontario yet. I don't believe it's even recorded from greenhouses at this point, but in the US, it's massive. It's in most states now. It still is limited to semi-tropical states, so it hasn't quite made its way to things like Maine and New York and Pennsylvania. But the lower states, certainly, it's completely overrun them. I could give an entire talk on the occupancy of Solenopsis invicta. There was actually throughout the 19th century a huge ant war between humans and ants that went on. A lot of chemicals applied to the environment to try and get rid of them, and it failed pretty miserably. So it is the occupancy is like increasing, and eventually with climate change, we're probably going to get them here at some point, unfortunately, and that's a big issue for native species because they do outcompete them almost entirely.
Actually, that raises actually one of my questions. So I'm going to just jump in here with my question.
No, no, no.
You mentioned the number of species that we know about, and
Yeah.
the potential new species that are being discovered around the world is double that. Is it
Yeah.
safe to assume that most of those are being discovered in tropical environments?
It's actually all across the globe. So it is more common in the tropics to find a new species. But the occurrence of things like social parasites is super understudied because you can imagine trying to get into a nest to find a solitary queen of a species that only flies at one time of the year rather than having workers that are on the surface all the time, super rare to encounter. And so there's quite a few species that are ongoing for discovery in around Canada. I'm actually naming a couple of new species actively right now that were found, one in New Brunswick and one here in Ontario.
Cool. And are we responsible for extirpation of any species at this point that we're aware of?
So there is a little bit of extirpation. Obviously, of the bog tent nesting species, because we're filling in a lot of wetlands and that kind of thing, and we are trying to rehabilitate some of those habitats. But once they're removed, it's really hard to get them reestablished. Those kind of species we have dealt a big blow to. Ants are pretty tolerant, though. Even in urban environments, the ants will be fairly successful, and so they'll kind of colonize those environments pretty easily. So there's not really any documented case of things like endangered species or at-risk species with ants. But the truth is we're also understudied in this regard. Like there's only three ant experts in taxonomy across all of Canada. One of them is retired. I'm kind of the newest one, and the other one hasn't found work in the past 5 years. So it's a tough situation for ants in Canada.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the list because there's still a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
I've got another one from Christian, and maybe I'll just shorten it a little bit. Can pheromonal communications be exploited by illegitimate receivers? And I think you touched
Yes.
on that a little bit.
Yeah. So, a lot of different species, like the myrmecophiles I talked about, they do use pheromonal cues. So there's a common species of cricket that's actually a social parasite of ants, and it will mimic the antennal tapping of ants, and it mimics some of the pheromones to get food from the ants. It will actually initiate trophallaxis or the regurgitation of food from the workers to get its own food resource. It's very commonly encountered in the Niagara Gorge area. But yeah, all kinds of other species will take advantage of things like pheromone cues.
Cool. Um, the next one I'm going to assume it was the recommendation. Someone asked about a recommendation for a not too technical book on ant biology. So the one you mentioned would be the
Yeah. A Field Guide to the Ants of New England, a very great resource. It covers a wide range of ant biology and uh, sampling techniques and how to find them in a very good common language as well.
Great. Thank you. Next question is also from Christian, who apparently really loves ants.
Yeah,
And
good.
it's a question that popped into my head as well. It was about the ants. How do they detect the health of the host
Mhm.
plant when they're farming the aphids?
Yes. So this is hugely complicated. It comes down to what's called tritrophic interactions, or it's the chemical interplay between different species going on. So just like how ants sense aphids in the environment, they smell the volatile chemicals given off by things like the honeydew. So as the honeydew evaporates, it releases compounds in the environment. Ants are very good at picking up chemicals so they can smell it and then go to that plant. The plant also releases chemicals when it's being wounded. It will say, I'm in danger. It will signal to other plants in the environment, I'm at risk, start to produce more defensive chemicals, stuff like that. So if those chemicals get up to a certain level, the ants will detect them and say, oh, we have to reduce the aphid population because the plant's at significant risk. They can also use visual cues. They can see if there's tarnishing of the leaves. They will tend to those kinds of things. Sometimes you'll see workers kind of making a beeline away from the aphids up the stem of the plant and onto the leaf and do kind of a tapping and looking around. They're also monitoring the health of the plant through those ways. So it's a really intense agricultural interplay that's going on, and that's been supported through evolutionary time through those chemicals, like I said.
So that's a group decision. It's not like the queen directing it.
No, yeah, so the thing about ant nests and ant communication, the queen actually doesn't really make any decisions herself. She will lay different casts or know when to lay ants based off of the pheromone density that's around her. But the workers are really the ones that are saying, this is what we need to do, or this is where we need to go in the environment. The colony will survive without the queen present until they die, and they'll keep functioning as a colony. They don't need the ant queen. There's, if anybody's interested in looking it up, there is a uh, I guess a case study of an ant colony that was over a nuclear bunker in around Chernobyl, and it was bleeding workers into the bunker, but the queen was in on the surface. The workers in the bunker itself started to function as an independent colony, so they started doing different things and had no other signals from their sisters up on the surface, but they still survived regardless. Highly encourage you to look that up if you're interested to see how that kind of plays out.
That's really cool. One last question from Christian is,
Yeah.
are there any invasive ant species that threaten the native species in southern Ontario?
Yeah. Um, so the European fire ant, Myrmica, that one does outcompete other ants for resources. It's not as bad as Solenopsis invicta. Myrmica rubra at this point has only existed in really disturbed areas. So places like lawns or agricultural fields, that kind of thing, hasn't invaded so much into things like forests so far. So mostly it's extirpated things like Lasius neoniger for lawn resources and that kind of thing. But as the temperatures increase, it will be able to invade cooler areas, places like those forests a lot more easily, and it could be a bigger risk. And then, of course, if we get Solenopsis invicta up here, that will be a huge detriment to a lot of native species. Um, and then the second part, are there any species that we as field naturalists should be looking out for in the GTA and beyond? Um, I think ants in general are really fascinating. If you want really charismatic species to have a look at, I really recommend going to oak savannas around Ontario and looking for the acorn ants. There's nothing more fun than opening up an acorn and you see an entire ant colony spill out. I think it's pretty awesome. Um, and then the carpenter ants are also really cool. Just rolling logs and seeing what's going on underneath them, you'll get a good indication of like how the brood care works and large colony dynamics if you see those species under those kinds of resources.
Great, thank you. And I think, oh, Michelle, this is an important one. My wife asks the same question all the time. Who are the ants that come into my house for a while every spring, and why do they do this?
Yes. So the most common species are in that Formicinae group. So the first ones that you'll probably see is the carpenter ants. They're the really big ones, and a lot of times it's the queens that have been overwintering in things like wood piles, and they might accidentally get into your home as you're trudging them in, or you might be moving plants around, that kind of thing. They were overwintering, and suddenly they're there. Not as big of an issue. If the queen dies, you're not going to see any more of them. You're also going to see the red and black ants and those black ants. They're very common mound builders on lawns. These species are often finding the warmest areas and the areas where they might find food first. And so you can imagine if you're opening your door or there's a crack in your windowsill or something, the ants are like, oh, this is a lot warmer than the environment I'm in right now. There could be food in there. So they're coming into your house early on in spring to try and find that food as early as possible. They usually slow down after the summer starts to warm up because they recognize there's not many food resources in these spaces unless you're kind of being messy in your kitchen. But you're not going to find as much as they would in the normal environment. So they kind of make their way back into the ecosystem at large.
Cool. What else? Question from Lynn about pileated woodpeckers. Do they destroy an entire carpenter ant nest in a tree when they drill?
It depends. Not a lot of carpenter ant colonies have the queen in the upper canopy. So most carpenter ants, because they're relying on things like rot, they exist first in the root systems of the plants or in down logs or on the surface of the soil. And then they'll send satellite colonies or little bits of workers into the upper canopy if the tree started to rot to get things like grubs and beetles and that kind of thing. So they will get picked off by pileated woodpeckers, but the main food resource that they rely on is the same that the ants rely on, which is the beetles that are existing in the bark. So not a big issue for the ants at large.
Great. And I think we have one last one,
Yeah.
which also popped into my head when you were showing the orchard. Is there a native species in Ontario that could be used for pest control?
Yes. So this is a fun subject because it's kind of emergent. Part of my PhD work was really looking at this, like what ant species are performing most of the predatory behaviors, what are the most common species. Laziest neoniger is one of the ones that I found on every agricultural field around Southern Ontario, and I monitored well over 200 fields. And they were performing a lot of predation. So they were feeding on things like caterpillars, aphids, all kinds of stuff. If you see them around the root systems of your plants, that's a good thing. A lot of the Myrmicinae species, so Myrmica, not, I mean, even Myrmica rubra is actually a good predatory species to have in agricultural fields and especially in apple cultivation. They will climb up the bark and feed on a lot of big pest species. Though it's an invasive species, extirpating other native species for that same resource. If you see any similar species in that Myrmicinae group, they are also performing a lot of that role. So if you want to look it up afterwards, highly encourage you to do so. But the Formicinae and Myrmicinae, anything in those two groups, they're really good predators to have in orchards. Yeah.
And that is so cool. I think as humans, we think our society is really complicated and complex, but I think ants have got us beat there. I really do.
Oh, and I didn't even scratch the surface. There's so many cool mechanisms that they use to like cool their nests and all kinds of things we could learn about agriculture. It's we could learn a lot from studying ants, is my opinion.
Wow. Okay, so we've reached the end of the questions. Thank you so much, Aaron. I
No
think it's been
problem.
a great talk. I mean, the questions show the interest level is really high. Really appreciate it. It was
Yeah,
really good.
happy to be here, and thank you very much for again for having me.
It was
Ellen, did you want to add
fascinating. Yeah,
here?
it was just wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We appreciate you being here. And as we mentioned earlier, if you're not a TFN member, look into it. We'd love to have you join the group or even join the lecture committee and help us line up more wonderful talks like the one we had today with Dr. Fairweather. Good night, everyone.